A former NATO commander has warned Europe to prepare for war as the conflict in Ukraine continues. Sir Richard Sheriff has praised Ukrainians for pushing the Russians back, saying the scene is setting for a collapse of the Russian army. But the retired British Army general says NATO must rearm European countries because of the threat from Vladimir Putin. It remains.
Most NATO armies, less probably the Americans, have gone through 2 decades worth of consistent and cumulative defence cuts. Stocks of ammunition, of weapons have been run down, of spares, and there is an enormous amount to do to gear up European armies to be prepared for the worst case.
Joining us live now is former Labor MP and past chair of Parliament's Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee, Michael Danby. Michael Danby, at this point in time, how should the West respond?
Morning, Gabrielle. Well, I think the number of attacks on civilians in Ukraine are making people in Europe angrier and angrier. Well, the obvious thing is air defence of Ukrainian cities. Both the Germans and Americans have agreed to speed up their anti-aircraft and anti-missile defence. Frankly, the Israelis should be asked to sell the Ukrainians at least some Iron Dome, which has protected Israeli cities. But I think it's coming to the point where if it's true, Gabrielle, that those missiles were shot from the Black Sea Fleet hiding in the eastern side of Crimea, the long-range missiles that the Ukrainians have been asking for a long time might be provided by the Americans. How many Ukrainian civilians have to die before we take this more seriously militarily? I mean, 100, 200, 1,000? But those Black Sea ships shooting those missiles off at Ukrainian civilians shouldn't be able to do it with impunity.
OK, what about sending the ADF to help train Ukrainians outside of Ukraine? Is this an appropriate measure? Is it too dangerous?
It's not too dangerous if it takes place outside Ukraine, but I think it's the New Zealanders are over there with the British at the moment, training them in artillery and various other systems over in the UK. I think it'd be better to send them more Bushmasters. The Ukrainians are perfecting a technique called thunder runs, where wheeled vehicles race ahead of the Russian lines. And we've got 1,000 Bushmasters sitting around in sheds in Australia. We should send them another 100 and, rebuild our stock from the factory. The factory's here in Australia. So I think Bushmasters rather than extra trainers would be more appropriate.
More Russian men have fled Russia than they've responded to Putin's mobilisation. Can the new Russians pressed into their army turn the tide on the battlefield for Russia?
Gabrielle, I'll give you one anecdote I just saw tragically the other day. A Russian family posted that their son was going for training in a famous town in a back area called Rostov-on-Don, and 2 days later they post his funeral notice. He'd been sent to the front in Donbass almost without any training. I don't think they'll make much of a difference. I don't think they'll arrive in time. I think the Ukrainian frontline troops are very hard, and according to British and US intelligence reports, 65,000 Russian men, soldiers, have been knocked out, killed, wounded, AWOL or captured.
OK. Look, what's the effect of the war in Ukraine having on China and its future military plans?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think that's the key thing for Australia, and the only hopeful thing to come out of this terrible conflict with the Ukrainian civilians paying so much of a price. The Chinese would be surprised at Western unity. The G7 meeting just today, the World Bank supporting the Ukrainians. They'd be very surprised. And the huge amount of aid that's been funneled into Ukraine, they'd also be taken aback a bit by the superiority of Western military technology, which they basically rely on Soviet models. Some of them are Chinese built, but they're based on Soviet designs or Russian designs. So the Western unity, the acrimony focused on Russia for its attacks, and the amount of economic and military aid that's gone to Ukraine would be seen by them as precedents for what might happen if they got more aggressive with Taiwan.
Look, finally, former Prime Minister Paul Keating is pleading with Canberra to pull out of the AUKUS agreement. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, poor old Uncle Paul. He's a great figure of Australian history, but he's dead wrong on this. I think he's been overcome by nostalgia for Beijing's past behaviour. I don't think the current government is paying much attention to him, and that's dictated by the circumstances. It's not designed to be rude to Paul Keating, nor am I disparaging him as a figure of Australian history. But he's wrong on this. The Australian government isn't listening because the Chinese are being very aggressive, including in our backyard. They're just sending off police trainers from the Solomons to China for training. Is that in Australia's interest, Paul Keating? I think not.
Michael Danby, we do have to leave it there. Appreciate your insights this morning.
Thanks, Gabrielle.